All right, today I want to talk about the Great Depression and the New Deal. And also, I just want to get you up, guys, ready for an assignment that'll be due on the 30th that's different from what you all have done before. Now, in preparation for this assignment, one of the things that I instructed you all to do was to look at the film series on YouTube uh, that was originally published by PBS on the New Deal. It's a series of hour-long black and white films dealing with the New Deal. Now, the New Deal and the Great Depression are very important. The New Deal is something that still affects American policy to this day. I mean, if you look at, say, for instance, Social Security, if you look at the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, if you look at subsidies for farmers, the programs to pay farmers not to grow food. If you look at any number of things, they had their origins in the New Deal. And so the New Deal is really important. Now, in a lot of ways, you could argue that the New Deal was kind of a continuation of the Progressive Era, because remember, we had the Progressive Era from about 1900 until about 1920 or so. Then you have the 1920s, which was a pretty conservative period. You had pretty conservative Republican presidents during the 1920s, and the basic approach to business during that time was a laissez-faire approach to business. I mean, the basic idea was you didn't bother a free market. You let people do it. You let businesses do what they needed to do. Also, during the 1920s, what we see too is that there was very little regulation, really no regulation of financial markets. That's why banks began to do things like, for instance, to take the money of depositors and invest it in the stock market. And of course, that was the kind of thing that went really great until the stock market collapsed. And one of the things you have to understand about stock markets is that I don't care how good a market is, it eventually collapses. I mean, it's just a rule of economics that, you can have a great bull market, but eventually there's going to be a bear. And what happens during bull markets is that, the longer bull markets go on, the more money that's being made. Eventually, businesses get the idea that, hey, there's always going to be a profit. And they start getting comfortable and being less rational in their approach to investment. And, that is really kind of at the heart of the Great Depression. The fact that there was a long period of economic growth, people became very comfortable, and they really ignored issues that were going on. If you all have watched your movies on, if you watch the Great Depression film, the Great Depression films, and if you look at the very first couple of episodes, it talks about how everything looked good. It talks about Henry Ford, how well he was doing and everything. But there were signs all along that the economy was slowing down. And the interesting thing is that people in rural areas, where farm prices had gone down, they were suffering long before you have the stock market collapse. They were in bad shape. And so what we see with the New Deal is that there's an attempt to try to develop a safety net in the American economy. Now, one of the things that's really significant about the New Deal, and one of the reasons I had you all look at the PBS films, is that there had been major depressions in American history before. The 1890s, for instance, had a depression that was probably as bad as the Great Depression, but it was in the 1890s. In the 1890s, film is a brand new technology. There is no radio. You don't have talking movies. You don't have a widely developed telephone system. You just don't have the way to preserve the experiences of people for posterity the way it happens in the 1930s. And so really one of the things to understand about the Great Depression is that as bad as the Great Depression was, we don't remember the Great Depression just because it was a really bad time. We remember it because there are films, there was the radio, and these things were recorded. You have films of people in bread lines. You have films of people, saying that people being foreclosed on. You have films of Okies, the people from the Midwest and the Southwest who end up going to California. You have films of these people. You have movies made about them. The book, The Grapes of Wrath, written by John Steinbeck, and which very quickly is made into a movie that dramatizes, just how bad things were with Okies. That is not something that's possible in the 1890s. And so really, that's one of the things you have to understand about the Great Depression. Now, also the Great Depression, we know about it too, because the Great Depression is only recently begun to slip outside of living memory. As recently as the year 2000, there were a lot of people around who remembered the stock market crash of 1929. In the year 2000, the stock market crash in 1929 was 71 years ago. And you had a lot of people in their 90s who were old enough to have remembered when it happens. Now, of course, it's almost the year 2021 now. And the great majority of people who were alive in 1929, between 1929 and 1933, they're dead now. And those who are alive were very little, and they're very old. And so the Great Depression, especially the beginning of the Great Depression, is about to slip out of living memory. But for a very long time, really, say from from 1929 to 2000, there were lots of people around. Or, you could say even until about 2005, there were a lot of people around who remembered the Great Depression. And so therefore, the Great Depression is close to us in living memory. But also, more importantly, even though the Great Depression is slipping out of living memory, it's really important to understand that, with talking films, with radio recordings, we still have very vivid images of the Great Depression, even though the great majority of people who had firsthand experience with the Great Depression have now died. Now, if you all remember from the previous tests I gave you, one of the things I had you all look at was a film on the Bonus Army. And, the Bonus Army were soldiers, veterans from World War I, who had gotten behind economically and who wanted a bonus given to them within their lifetimes in order to give them a leg up so they could be more successful in the economy. And during the last year of Herbert Hoover's administration, the Bonus Army came to Washington, D.C. They set up a camp city, and the government violently removed them. People died. The tent city was burned down. And this was one of the things that really helped to seal Herbert Hoover's fate as a one-term president. And as a president who was really beaten very badly. I mean, really, now, the current election, the recent election, was won very decisively by Biden. Now, those of y'all who feel that it was stolen from or whatever, as far as I can tell, as far as our official numbers are, Biden won. And if you look at the official statistics, he won by about 4 points. And it was a pretty big win. But the win that he had was not as impressive as Roosevelt had by a pretty long stretch. I mean, Herbert Hoover had managed to really alienate a lot of people because he was very much a free market person. And he did not feel it was the place of government to interfere in the economic process. Now, the great irony, of course, is that Herbert Hoover was a guy who was known for doing charity work in Europe. But he did not do that in America. He felt that, if people were hungry or whatever, that this was something that private people should do, that government shouldn't be involved. Now, and so because of this, people really were angry. They were like, look, there's not enough money from the private sector to help us. We need government to intervene. And so because of that, Roosevelt was able to win. And so Roosevelt won, during the election. He said he was going to give the people a New Deal. But now the interesting thing about it is that Roosevelt didn't particularly have an actual program drawn up. As a matter of fact, when Roosevelt first comes to power, and you have the collapsing of banking, and banking is collapsing, when Roosevelt comes into power, for a basic reason. Banks always loan more money than they actually have in their reserves. Now, the reason for this, of course, is that banks make money with loans. They take deposits, they make loans on it, whether they're housing loans, auto loans, business loans, farm loans, and they make a profit by the interest they charge on the loans. Now, what happens is that when you have a collapse of the banking system, everybody wants their money. And because banks always loan more money than they actually have, if everybody comes asking for the money, then the bank collapses. Now, Roosevelt dealt with this initially by shutting down the banks and, basically keeping people from taking their money out the bank. And, the Federal Reserve gives money to the banks. And that allows banks to function. Now, what happens is a lot of people lose money. And matter of fact, it's interesting. They lose about $540 million. Now, in today's money, that would be a little bit over $10 billion. And so people lost a substantial money. Now, eventually the government reimbursed people. People got about 85 cents on the dollar, but that took a number of years. But the point to be made is that this initial legislation that Roosevelt passed was actually something that Herbert Hoover's people wrote. And so, Roosevelt, even though he felt that Herbert Hoover had done a poor job, he was not averse to using, Herbert Hoover's ideas initially. However, Roosevelt would take things further. And this is where it really got interesting. Like, for instance, some of the things that Roosevelt did early on, like, for instance, you had the period of the 100 days. And what Roosevelt did was that Roosevelt tried to stimulate production. Because with the collapse of the economy, what happened is that America went into a period of deflation. Now, America came close to deflation during the Great Recession that happened at the end of the Bush administration and, went into the Obama administration. But deflation is a very different animal. Most of our lifetimes, the Federal Reserve and other organizations, other financial organizations have been concerned about inflation. Inflation, of course, is when prices continually rise. And to be honest with you, inflation is easier to manage than deflation. Because what happens is that once you have deflation, and prices start to collapse, then it's almost impossible to get people to invest, because if you put $1,000 in a business, and a year from now, your $1,000 is only worth $960. Why invest? And so that's one of the reasons why during the Great Depression, and this is something I know about because my parents lived through the Great Depression. I mean, a lot of you all may have grandparents and great-grandparents who dealt with it. But like I said, you had to be kind of older to I'm old enough that I had family that dealt directly with it. But one of the things you have because of deflation during the Great Depression is that people did stuff like save up all their money and put it in the mattress. They'd sew it up in the mattress. Because with deflation, they weren't going to make money back. They'd lose money. You might as well just hold on to your money. Now, what we see as a result of this is that Roosevelt decided to try to stimulate the economy. And one of the things he did, for instance, with the farms, was that he sought to reduce overcapacity. Now, some of the things he did were very, very extreme by this, compared to what people expected. Like, for instance, Roosevelt, bought livestock from farmers, like hogs. And they simply just, shot the hogs and buried them in trenches. Now, this was something that most people couldn't understand because, people were literally starving. If you all have seen those movies on the Great Depression, for instance, some of you all might remember there's one film where, a guy's talking, where a man works for the gas company and he has to go cut the gas off at a lady's house. And the lady begs, please let me finish cooking my meal. And he said, no, I can't do that. And he looks down and he sees that, she has, he sees the head of the family dog on the ground. Basically the last thing she had to cook was the family dog. She killed the family dog and she's cooking it for the children to eat. Because people were literally starving. People were starving. People were starving in America. The way that younger Americans think of people, say, in parts of Africa where you have civil wars, it was starving like that. And so when Roosevelt pays the farmers to kill livestock, when he pays the farmer to go out there with their tractors and plow under crops, people can't understand this. But the thing to understand is that he's trying to reduce oversupply so he can actually, maybe have a little inflation and encourage economic activity. Now, the thing about this farm program is that it directly seeks to change supply and demand. But the Great Depression goes even further. I mean, the New Deal goes even further. Because what we see is that the government begins to develop organizations like the Civilian Conservation Corps, the NRA, the National Recovery Act, and they begin to give people jobs. The federal government gives people jobs. The Civilian Conservation Corps, they take young men, they have them going out working in parks and stuff. People are put to work because, frankly, there's not enough money for people to make it. Now, this is possible because when Roosevelt comes into power, the Republican Party is just basically blown out of Congress. I mean, at one point, I think Roosevelt has like a 77 to like, let's see, at that time there were 48 states. And so he has something like a 77 to 21 majority in the U.S. Senate. Basically he could get anything he wanted passed. And so we begin to see the development of lots of public programs. Now, the one thing that's interesting is that you have a situation like you have right now, where even though you have a Democratic president coming in, the Republican president before him was able to have a Supreme Court that was full of conservative Supreme Court justices. And so what happens is that a lot of Roosevelt's ideas are shut down. Now, eventually Roosevelt, and this is something that happens in his second term, decides that he wants to pack the court, which, to appoint more justices. And, you have to understand this is constitutional, because there is nothing in Constitution that says how many justices there are on the Supreme Court. We could have a 20-justice Supreme Court if Congress would pass it and the president would sign it. It would be perfectly legal. And as a matter of fact, there have been times in history when we've had 10 justices on the Supreme Court. Right now, we only have 9. But there have been times when there were 10 justices. And so Roosevelt threatened to pack the court. But once he did this, the Supreme Court, rather than to have the court packed, basically just started ruling the way that Roosevelt wanted to rule. And so what we see is that, the first New Deal, kind of gets shut down. But there are some very important things that happen. Like, for instance, we see that Roosevelt develops Social Security. Now, Social Security is very important because America was the only developed country in the world that did not have a national pension plan. Other countries in the West that had pension plans going back 70 years. I know, like, for instance, Germany had a pension plan going back to about 1865. And so Social Security became the American pension plan. Now, one of the interesting things about the New Deal, however, is that Roosevelt had a New Deal coalition. The support for the New Deal was very strong in the South because the South was the poorest part of the country. It was the least industrialized part of the country. And so therefore the South really benefited from any kind of federal intervention. If you had federal money going into farms, for instance, with the Tennessee Valley Authority, you have this huge infrastructure program going on in the Upper South that gives a lot of people electricity and gives a lot of jobs to people. So that's very, very popular. However, the price that Roosevelt had to pay for Southern support was that he had to support segregation. And he also had to support laws that were discriminatory. Like, for instance, although Social Security becomes the very first law in America to create a national pension system, the Social Security bill was written in such a way that rural workers, sharecroppers, domestics, or even people who were domestics, like maids or butlers, that they were not eligible for pensions. Now, needless to say, sharecroppers and maids back in the 1930s were overwhelmingly African American. And so this meant that black people in the South got relatively little benefit from federal programs. Now, the other component, however, of the New Deal coalition were people in big cities. Now, this is interesting because this is where you do have African American votes, because you have the great migration of African Americans to northern cities that begins in the early part of the 19th century and really picks up during World War I and continues during the 1920s. I mean, that's why you had the Harlem Renaissance, and goes on through the 1930s. And so therefore you have big northern cities like St. Louis, for instance, Chicago, Detroit, New York, Philadelphia, Milwaukee, Boston. All these cities get huge influxes of African Americans moving into them. And so what we see is that African Americans begin to get elected to Congress. Like, for instance, Chicago, you have Chicago elects a congressman, Oscar DePriest. Now, he happens to be a Republican because, most black folks from the South were still Republicans. But what we see is that by the time you get into the 1930s, the great majority of African Americans living in the North have become Democrats because they realize that democratic programs are beneficial to poor people. and African Americans were disproportionately part of the poor population. And so, therefore you'll see a number of films in the Great Depression that talk about, African Americans trying to push and make sure that they benefit from federal government programs. Unlike, for instance, you have the film on New York where they show the New York mayor, Fiorello LaGuardia, who is an interesting fellow. He's half Italian, half Jewish. And he's very multilingual. He speaks a lot of languages, and so therefore he's very successful among white ethnic politicians. However, he doesn't do a whole lot for black politicians, and so for the black communities. And so what we see is that the black community begins to protest and boycott businesses in Harlem until they are able to get employment opportunities. And so what we see is that the New Deal really changes things around. The New Deal, just the situation I talked about with African Americans. The New Deal ends the previous 65 or so years of African Americans primarily being Republicans because of the fact that Lincoln was a Republican and Lincoln freed the slaves. As a result of the New Deal, you begin to have a major shift towards Democrats. And, 90 years later, we still see that the great majority of African Americans are Democrats. Now, also what we see during the Great Depression is that we see the Wagner Act, for instance, that's passed. That's in 1935, the same year you have Social Security. Now, that is a law that's really important because it allows for labor unions to organize and to have closed shops. In other words, they're able to demand that everybody, once they have an election for a union, they're able to demand that everybody at a particular place be a member of the union. And so what this means is that businesses can no longer hire scabs, people who aren't union members, to bust a union. And so what we see is that from 1935 until about 1950, this is the strongest period of unions in American history. Now, eventually, after World War II, you have the Taft-Hartley Act passed in 1947. And then you begin to see a gradual decline in unions because that's when you have the right to work laws. And as you all know nowadays, most of, even areas in the Midwest that are, very, very strong union areas, like Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, Missouri, Wisconsin, all these states are right to work states. I mean, Illinois is kind of one of the last holdovers that still, is a pro-union state, in the sense that it still allows closed shops. And, some of the states back east, like New York or Massachusetts, still are allow for closed unions. But the result of that is that, for the last 70 years, there's been a steady decline in the percentage of people who are union members. But like I said, unions become strong because of the period from 1935 to 1947 because of the Wagner Act. And that's something that's done as part of the New Deal. Now, one thing I want to kind of throw out for you is that one common criticism of the New Deal is that although you have all of this government expansion, and although you have all this government activity in the economy, the Depression gets better for a while in the 1930s, then it comes back again. Conservatives make the argument that the New Deal never completely defeats the Depression, and they are correct. Conservatives are correct when they make that argument. The New Deal does not get rid of the Depression. What I would argue is that the New Deal, although it does not get rid of the Depression, it makes conditions much better for everyday people. Instead of a situation where people are starving and people are homeless and living in the streets in large numbers, which you have at the beginning of the Great Depression. As time goes on, people get jobs, they're able to survive, they're able to make ends meet. They're not living well. America isn't prosperous, but people are able to survive. Which, if you're poor and hungry, being able to have some kind of job and being able to get some kind of meal beats the pants off of being starving and homeless. Now, ultimately, the thing that completely ends the Great Depression is World War II. And it's really interesting because by the time you get to World War II, although Roosevelt's president, Roosevelt is the only president in American history who served more than 2 terms. He was elected 4 times, and he died very early in his 4th term. And of course, that's when Harry Truman becomes president. And then after that, the Constitution is changed where presidents can only run for 2 terms, which had been customary before Roosevelt anyway. But anyway, the point to be made is that World War II ends the Great Depression because in order to fight such a major war, America ends up ramping up its industrial production, putting everybody to work. Every man is either a soldier getting a salary or is working in a factory. Because so many men, 12 million men are in the military, and no, they're not all men, but I say you probably have like 11.5 million men in the military, about maybe 500,000 women. Because so many people are in the military, millions of women go to work, and all of a sudden, you have full employment, full production, and the Great Depression ends. And as a result, at the end of World War II, America becomes the strongest economy in the world, ends up producing 75% of all the industrial capacity in the world. And that's because of World War II, not the New Deal. But I could argue that the New Deal meant that Americans didn't starve, and that at least it kept the economy going good enough that when World War II popped up, America was quickly able to mobilize its economy. Well, anyway, class, now the assignment I'm giving you for your paper due next week is to simply take one of the films about the Great Depression, and I want you to write about what you see in that film. I want you to write about what do you see in the film compared to what you have read in the books, compared to what you've heard in lecture. Can you see the economic forces that caused the Depression? Can you see the impact of the New Deal? Do you see how the New Deal affects different communities, like Black Americans, white Americans? Do you see where Roosevelt's successful? Do you see where he runs into problems? I just want you to talk about any movie that you see in the Great Depression series. Give me about a 5-paragraph answer for you. Because, normally I ask you to do 2 essays, 2 paragraphs each. I want you to give me about a 4 or 5 paragraph essay on, any of these films in the Great Depression. I'll give you a little bit more instruction in writing, but that's your basic assignment for next week. Anyway, I hope you all enjoy your Thanksgiving. And, the semester's coming near to an end. There's going to be one more assignment that'll be due on December 11th. And, I hope you guys have picked up some good information on American history. Even though I haven't got to meet you guys and talk to you, I am a teacher. I enjoy teaching. And I hope you all have gotten some useful information out of this class. And I'll see you in at least one more lecture before the semester's over. Have a good day and have a good holiday week.